Elena Winters had spent her entire life blending into the background. Today was no different as she made her way through the crowded streets, clutching her worn leather notebook to her chest like a shield. The community center loomed ahead, its brick facade nothing special to most passers-by, but to Elena it might as well have been a palace of judgment. She paused at the entrance, watching well-dressed people stream inside, their confident chatter washing over her. They all seemed to belong here, unlike her. At 42, Elena had never attended anything like this before, a monthly piano showcase hosted by Maestro Grayson, whose reputation in their small city carried the weight of royalty in musical circles. "Excuse me," someone muttered, brushing past her frozen form in the doorway. Elena mumbled an apology and finally stepped inside, the warmth of the building a stark contrast to the October chill that had nipped at her fingers the entire walkover. Those same fingers now fidgeted with the button of her coat, a practical garment that had seen better days, much like its owner. The community center's main hall had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs faced a gleaming grand piano that sat beneath soft spotlight. Elena chose a seat in the back row where shadows offered comfort. From here she could watch without being watched, learn without being judged. As the seats filled around her, no one offered a greeting or even a curious glance. Elena was used to this particular brand of invisibility. As a girl, teachers had sometimes forgotten her name by year's end. As an adult, she could go weeks with only her elderly neighbor acknowledging her existence beyond necessary transactions at the grocery store or library where she worked. The lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the audience as a tall man with silver-streaked hair stepped onto the small stage. Maestro Grayson moved with the assurance of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space. "Welcome, friends and music lovers," he began, his voice carrying easily without seeming to try. "Tonight we continue our tradition of showcasing both established talents and emerging artists from our community." Elena sank deeper into her chair. She had come tonight not just to listen, but to gather courage. After 15 years of playing alone in her apartment, composing melodies that no one had heard, she had made a promise to herself. This year would be different. This year, she would stop hiding. The first performer was a young woman who played Chopin with technical precision. Elena watched her fingers dance across the keys, admiring the confidence in each movement. The second was a university student who performed his own composition, an impressive but safe piece that drew appreciative nods from the maestro. As the evening progressed, Elena studied each performer, noting how the maestro responded to different styles and techniques. He was generous with his applause but specific with his feedback, occasionally interrupting to demonstrate a passage himself. "The difference," he explained after one performance, "is not in the notes themselves, but in how you approach them. Listen." His hands touched the keys, and the same sequence of notes somehow transformed, becoming something that made Elena's chest tighten with emotion. By intermission, she had filled 3 pages of her notebook with observations, not musical notation. Elena had taught herself to play by ear and couldn't read sheet music, but words describing how certain phrases made her feel, techniques she wanted to try. "Are you a student of Grayson's?" Elena startled at the question, nearly dropping her notebook. A woman with kind eyes stood beside her seat, coffee cup in hand. "No, I just came to listen," Elena replied, surprised anyone had noticed her enough to speak. "First time here, I'm Lily." The woman smiled. "My daughter performed earlier, the Bach piece." "It was beautiful," Elena said honestly. "I'm Elena. Do you play?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Elena hesitated. She had played every day for 15 years, but was she a player in the way this woman meant? "A little," she admitted finally. "Just for myself." Lily nodded, seeming to understand something Elena hadn't fully expressed. "Well, if you ever want to share your playing, the sign-up sheet for next month's showcase will go around after the final performance. Grayson's tough but fair." When Lily left to retake her seat, Elena felt both seen and terrified of being seen. She hadn't planned to sign up tonight, had told herself this was just reconnaissance, the first step in a much longer journey. The second half of the showcase featured more experienced performers. A retired piano teacher played Debussy with such feeling that Elena found herself blinking back unexpected tears. Two brothers performed a duet that made the audience laugh with delight at their playful interpretation. Throughout it all, Maestro Grayson remained the gravitational center of the room. His approval was subtle, a slight nod, a thoughtful, but performers clearly lived for these small acknowledgments. His disapproval was equally restrained but unmistakable. A quick glance at his watch, a slight tightening around his mouth, as the final performer took her bow, Elena felt a curious mix of inspiration and despair. These people belonged here. Their talent had been cultivated in proper lessons, nurtured in recitals and competitions. Her playing, born in the solitude of her apartment with a second-hand upright piano she'd saved 3 years to buy, seemed suddenly childish in comparison. The maestro stepped forward once more. Thank you all for another evening of music and community. Before we conclude, I'll send around the sign-up sheet for next month's showcase. As always, new performers are welcome, though I do maintain certain standards. His gaze swept the room, seeming to pass right through Elena as if she were made of glass. A clipboard began making its way through the rows, and Elena watched its progress with growing anxiety. Around her, people were gathering their things, conversations picking up in volume as the formal portion of the evening concluded. The clipboard moved closer, 3 rows away. 2. Elena's heart pounded so loudly she was certain others must hear it. She should leave now, before the clipboard reached her row. She wasn't ready. This had been a foolish idea. But her body refused to move, anchored by a lifetime of watching from the sidelines and the sudden, desperate desire to step forward. The clipboard arrived in her hands, the sheet nearly full of names written in varying styles. Elena stared at it, time stretching impossibly thin. The person beside her cleared their throat gently, waiting. With a hand that trembled slightly, Elena wrote her name in the last empty space, her ordinary handwriting a stark contrast to the flourishing signatures above it. She added her phone number, the digits looking strange and exposed on the public page. As she passed the clipboard along, no lightning struck, no dramatic music swelled. The world continued exactly as before, except for the thundering of blood in her ears and the strange lightness in her chest. Elena gathered her notebook and coat, rising from her seat while most others were still engaged in conversation. She moved toward the exit, passing close to where the maestro stood surrounded by admirers. For just a moment his eyes flicked toward her, not in recognition, but in the automatic way people track movement in their peripheral vision. There was no acknowledgement, no sense that he had registered her as anything more than another shadow passing through his sphere. Outside, the night air cooled Elena's flushed cheeks. She took a deep breath, clutching her notebook tighter as reality settled around her. She had done it. Her name was on the list. In 1 month she would sit at that gleaming grand piano and play her own composition, a piece that had lived only in her apartment and in her heart for years. The walk home seemed both longer and shorter than usual. Elena's mind raced with everything she needed to do to prepare. Her piece needed refinement. She would need to practice differently, imagining an audience where there had never been one before. As she unlocked the door to her small apartment, familiar darkness greeted her. She flicked on the light to reveal her modest living space, dominated by the upright piano against the wall. Not a prestigious instrument, but one that had been her faithful companion for 15 years. Elena set down her notebook and coat. Without bothering to make tea or even remove her shoes, she sat at the piano bench, her fingers hovering over the keys that knew her better than any person ever had. 1 month, she whispered to herself and began to play. The morning light filtered through Elena's thin curtains, casting a gentle glow across her small apartment. She had barely slept. The weight of what she'd done yesterday, signing up for the piano showcase, had kept her tossing and turning all night. Now, as she made her morning tea, reality settled in her stomach like a stone. What was I thinking? She whispered to the empty room. Her gaze drifted to the upright piano that had been her faithful companion for 15 years. It wasn't fancy. The mahogany finish had dulled with age, and a few keys had the faintest yellow tint that no amount of cleaning could remove. But it was hers, bought with 3 years of careful saving from her library assistant's salary. Elena carried her tea to the piano bench and sat down, running her free hand lightly over the keys without pressing them. Unlike the gleaming grand piano at the community center, this instrument knew all her secrets. Every tear-stained melody, every joy-filled improvisation, every lullaby she'd composed on sleepless nights. 1 month, she reminded herself. 4 weeks to get ready. After finishing her tea, Elena opened her leather notebook to a fresh page. She couldn't write music in the traditional sense. She'd never learned to read or write sheet music. But over the years, she'd developed her own system of symbols and words to remind herself of melodies and emotional tones. The piece she wanted to play had lived in her heart for years, evolving bit by bit. It had started as a simple tune she'd plunked out during a thunderstorm 7 years ago, when the power had gone out and she'd had nothing but candlelight and loneliness for company. Over time, it had grown more complex, gathering emotions like a river collects tributaries. Elena began to play softly, at first, then with growing confidence as the familiar notes surrounded her. The morning slipped away as she worked, adjusting a phrase here, extending a pause there, sometimes stopping to scribble notes to herself. At noon, her phone alarm chimed, reminding her of her shift at the library. Elena reluctantly closed the piano lid and got ready for work, her mind still swimming with music. The library had been Elena's workplace for almost 2 decades. The quiet routine suited her, shelving books, helping the occasional patron, processing new arrivals. Today, however, she found herself moving through her tasks in a fog, her fingers sometimes tapping out rhythms on book spines. "You seem distracted today," observed Ruth, the head librarian, as they sorted returns together. Ruth was in her 60s with gray hair cut in a practical bob and kind eyes behind reading glasses. "Everything okay?" Elena hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about signing up for the showcase. Saying it aloud would make it real in a way that felt dangerous. "I'm fine," she said, then, surprising herself, added, "Actually, I signed up to play piano at the community center showcase next month." Ruth's eyebrows rose. "I didn't know you played. That's wonderful, Elena." "I'm not trained or anything," Elena hurried to explain. "I just play for myself, but I thought maybe—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex mix of longing and fear that had driven her decision. "It's about time you shared your gifts," Ruth said simply, patting Elena's hand before returning to her work. The rest of the day passed in a blur. When her shift ended, Elena declined Ruth's invitation to join her for coffee, eager to return to her piano. The brief conversation had left her feeling both exposed and strangely energized. Back home, Elena opened her windows to let in the cool evening air. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old house, with her nearest neighbors far enough away that her playing rarely disturbed anyone. Still, she usually kept the windows closed when she practiced, another habit of privacy. Tonight felt different. As she sat at the piano, she imagined someone passing by might hear her music drifting out, a small step toward being heard. For the next 2 weeks, Elena fell into a new routine. Mornings before work and evenings after were dedicated to practice. She recorded herself on her old phone, listening back with critical ears. Each day her piece became more refined, though doubts continued to plague her. Would people think her music too simple? Too strange? Would the maestro cut her off mid-performance with a dismissive wave? On a rainy Saturday with 2 weeks left before the showcase, Elena did something she'd never done before. She played for someone else. Ruth had mentioned wanting to hear her, and Elena had impulsively invited her over for tea. "Your place is lovely," Ruth said as she entered, taking in the small but tidy apartment with its bookshelves lining one wall and the piano commanding attention on another. "It's not much," Elena replied, suddenly self-conscious about the worn furniture and the water stain on the ceiling that her landlord had promised to fix months ago. They drank tea and made small talk until Ruth finally said, "I'd love to hear you play if you're comfortable." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "It's not finished yet," she warned, moving to the piano bench. "And I'm still working on some parts." "I'm not a critic," Ruth reminded her gently. "Just a friend who loves music." Taking a deep breath, Elena began to play. For the first few measures, her fingers felt stiff and uncooperative, her awareness of Ruth's presence overwhelming. But gradually, the music took over, and she forgot to be afraid. When she finished, the silence felt thick with possibility. Elena kept her eyes on the keys, afraid to look up. "Elena." Ruth's voice was soft with wonder. "That was beautiful." "Really? It's not too—" Elena struggled to find the word. "Amateur, emotional, revealing." "It's honest," Ruth said firmly. "In a world of copies and technical show-offs, your music sounds like you. Like something real." That night after Ruth left, Elena played with renewed purpose. Ruth's words had given her something precious: permission to believe in her own voice. The 8 following days brought both progress and setbacks. Some mornings Elena woke filled with inspiration, adding new depths to her composition. Other days, doubt crept in like a cold draft, making her question everything. A week before the showcase, disaster struck. Elena caught a cold that settled in her chest, leaving her coughing and feverish. For 3 days, she couldn't even sit at the piano without being overcome by exhaustion. "You should withdraw," Ruth suggested when Elena called in sick to work. "There will be other showcases." "No," Elena said with unexpected firmness. "I need to do this." By the weekend, her fever had broken, but the lost practice time had shaken her confidence. Her piece, which had felt nearly complete, now seemed full of holes and weaknesses. With just 5 days left, Elena pushed herself harder, practicing, until her fingers ached and her neighbors knocked on the wall. The night before the showcase, Elena couldn't bring herself to play at all. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, trying to calm her racing thoughts. What if she forgot the music? What if she froze on stage? What if everyone laughed? Worse still, what if no one reacted at all? What if her music, like Elena herself, simply passed unnoticed? She took out her leather notebook and flipped through pages of notes and memories. Near the back, she found something she'd written years ago, after hearing a street musician play for an indifferent. "Quote, the music doesn't need permission to matter." Elena traced the words with her fingertip. She had written them as a comfort to herself on days when playing seemed pointless, when the silence of her apartment felt less like freedom and more like exile. Now, they reminded her why she was doing this. Not for applause, not for the maestro's approval, but because after 15 years of playing in solitude, her music deserved air and light. That night, Elena slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The morning of the showcase dawned clear and crisp. Elena moved through her preparations with a strange calm. She chose her outfit carefully, not the plainest dress in her closet as she might have done before, but a deep blue one she'd bought years ago and rarely worn. She even put on a necklace, a simple silver pendant that had belonged to her mother. As she locked her apartment door, Elena patted her pocket where she kept a small paper with notes about her piece. She wouldn't need it. The music lived in her hands now, but its presence comforted her. The walk to the community center took 20 minutes. With each step, Elena felt herself transforming, not into someone else, but into a more complete version of herself. By the time the brick building came into view, the woman who had once hidden in the back row felt like a distant relative, familiar but increasingly foreign. Elena paused at the entrance, just as she had a month ago. This time, however, she didn't hesitate. She pulled open the door and stepped inside, ready to be heard. The community center hummed with activity as Elena stepped inside. Unlike her first visit, when she'd slipped in unnoticed, today she had arrived early. A young man at a small table checked her name against a list and handed her a program. "Performers should sit in the reserved section up front," he explained, pointing to the first 2 rows. "You're scheduled 12th after the intermission." Elena nodded. her throat suddenly too dry for words. She glanced at the program in her hands, and there it was. Her name, printed in the same font as everyone else's. Not highlighted or decorated, but present. Visible. Instead of heading to the front, Elena found a seat toward the middle of the room. She wasn't ready to join the other performers yet, those confident people with their sheet music and years of training. From her spot, she watched them greet each other like old friends, some demonstrating hand movements to others, some sitting, with eyes closed in concentration. Nearby, a mother tried to smooth her young son's cowlick while he squirmed impatiently. An elderly couple helped each other remove their coats, the woman adjusting the man's collar with practiced tenderness. A group of college students entered laughing, their energy brightening the room. These would be her audience. Real people with their own lives and worries who had come here for an evening of music. The thought was both terrifying and strangely calming. The crowd continued to grow until nearly every seat was filled. Elena spotted Ruth slipping in just before the starting time, her familiar face a welcome anchor in the sea of strangers. Ruth gave a small wave when their eyes met, and Elena managed a tight smile in return. At precisely 7 o'clock, Maestro Grayson strode onto the stage. His presence immediately commanded attention, silencing the murmurs that had filled the room. His silver-streaked hair caught the light as he turned to face the audience, his posture impeccable. "Welcome to our monthly showcase," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "Tonight we have 12 performers who will share their musical journeys with us. As always, I ask that you hold your applause until each performance is complete." He consulted a sheet of paper in his hand. "Our first performer this evening is Thomas Chen, playing Bach's Italian Concerto First Movement." A young man approached the piano with confident steps. Elena watched intently as he adjusted the bench, took a breath, and began to play. His fingers moved with practiced precision, drawing out Bach's intricate patterns with apparent ease. "When," he finished. The applause was enthusiastic. The maestro offered brief comments, mostly praise with a few technical suggestions. Thomas nodded respectfully before returning to his seat. The next performer was a middle-aged woman who played Chopin. Her interpretation was more emotional than technical, and Elena found herself drawn into the music in a way that surprised her. The maestro's feedback was more extensive this time, focusing on dynamics and phrasing. As the showcase continued, Elena's anxiety began to shift. With each performance, the reality of what she was about to do became clearer. These people weren't just technically skilled. They were accomplished musicians who had studied their craft for years. By the 5th performance, Elena's palms were sweating. By the 7th, she was seriously considering slipping out during the applause. Who was she? To think she belonged here? Her self-taught playing would seem childish compared to what the audience had already heard. The young man next to her must have noticed her distress. "First time performing?" he whispered during a brief pause between pieces. Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice. "Me too," he confided. "I'm 10th on the program. Been playing since I was 6, but I still feel like I might throw up." His casual honesty made Elena smile despite herself. "I'm 12th," she whispered back. "Good luck," he said as the next performer began. "We'll both need it." Before Elena knew it, the maestro was announcing the intermission. The lights came up, and people began to move about, stretching legs and exchanging comments on the performances. So far, Elena remained seated, her mind racing. She should practice one more time. No, that would only increase her nerves. She should get some air. No, she might lose her courage if she left the building. She should... "Elena?" Ruth's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "How are you holding up?" Elena looked up to find her friend standing beside her, concern evident in her eyes. "I can't do this," Elena said quietly. "These people are real musicians. I'm just..." She gestured helplessly. Ruth sat down in the empty seat beside her. "Do you remember what I told you about your playing?" "That it's honest," Elena recalled. "Exactly. These others are talented, yes. But your music has something special. It has you in it." Ruth squeezed her hand. "Besides, you're not doing this for them. You're doing it for yourself, remember? Elena took a deep breath. For myself, she repeated. The intermission ended too quickly. As people returned to their seats, the maestro called the 10th performer, the nervous young man who'd spoken to Elena. Despite his earlier confession, he played Liszt with remarkable confidence. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. The 11th performer was an older woman who had brought her own sheet music. Her original composition was modern and challenging, with dissonant chords that made several audience members shift uncomfortably. The maestro's feedback was polite but reserved, and then suddenly it was time. Our final performer tonight is Elena Winters, the maestro announced, consulting his program with a slight frown, as if trying to recall who she was. Elena stood on legs that felt like water. The walk to the piano seemed miles long, the eyes of the audience heavy upon her. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered something she couldn't hear. At the edge of her vision, she saw several people checking their watches or gathering their coats, assuming the important performances were all ready. However, the maestro stepped aside with a perfunctory nod as she reached the piano. Up close, his presence was even more intimidating. His critical eyes, his slight frown, the pen poised in his hand, ready to make notes on her performance. The grand piano gleamed under the lights, far more imposing than her familiar upright home. Elena adjusted the bench and placed her hands in her lap, taking a moment to steady herself. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, Elena found herself back in her apartment, playing for no one but herself. The weight of the keys, the tension of the strings, the way sound filled empty spaces. These were the same here as they were at home. The music lived in her, not in the instrument. With that thought, Elena placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes were simple, a melody line she'd first discovered during a rainstorm years ago. It was tentative at first, like someone testing whether it was safe to speak. Then, gradually, it opened up, gaining confidence and complexity. She had no sheet music to follow, only the map in her heart that she'd been creating for 15 years. Her piece told a story without words, of solitude that wasn't quite loneliness, of quiet joy found in small moments, of patience in waiting, and finally finding voice. Somewhere around the middle of her piece, Elena forgot about the audience. She forgot about the maestro with his critical pen. She even forgot about her own anxiety. There was only the music, flowing through her fingers as naturally as breath. When she reached the part she thought of as the turning point, where the melody transformed from question to answer, Elena opened her eyes. The hall had fallen completely, silent. Not the polite silence of an audience listening, but the deeper silence of people genuinely captivated. In the front row, a woman had closed her eyes, her expression peaceful. Nearby, the college students who had entered laughing were now entirely still, their attention fixed on the music. Even the restless young boy had stopped fidgeting, his small face serious with concentration. And the maestro? Elena almost missed a note when she glanced his way. He had stopped writing. His pen hung forgotten in his hand, and his usual mask of professional assessment had slipped to reveal something else entirely. Surprise. Elena returned her focus to the keys, to the final section of her piece. This part had always been the most personal, the notes climbing toward something that felt like release. As her fingers brought the melody to its conclusion, not with a dramatic flourish but with a gentle resolution, she felt a strange sense of completion. The final note hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a moment, no one moved. Elena sat with her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her heart pounding in her ears. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had her playing been so bad that the audience was embarrassed for her? Then from somewhere in the back, someone began to clap. Another person joined in, then another. The applause spread through the room, growing from scattered appreciation to something warmer and more enthusiastic. Elena finally dared to look up, fully. People were smiling, not the polite smiles they'd offered the other performers, but genuine smiles that reached their eyes. Ruth was on her feet, applauding with unabashed pride. And the maestro was looking at Elena as if seeing her for the first time. The applause continued as Elena sat frozen at the piano bench. She had expected polite clapping at best, the kind given out of obligation rather than appreciation. This was something else entirely, something warm and genuine that filled the room and wrapped around her like an embrace. When the clapping finally began to fade, Elena realized she should return to her seat. She rose on unsteady legs, unsure of the proper protocol. The other performers had received feedback from the maestro before leaving the stage. Should she wait? Or would he simply dismiss her with a nod? Before she could decide, Maestro Grayson stepped forward. The audience quieted immediately, eager to hear his assessment. Elena braced herself. Even with the unexpected applause, she knew her technique was nowhere near the level of the other performers. The maestro was known for his honesty, sometimes brutally so. "Ms. Winters," he began, his voice carrying the same authority it had all evening, but then he paused, seeming to search for words, something Elena hadn't seen him do with any previous performer. "Your piece," he continued after a moment. "You composed it yourself?" Elena nodded, finding her voice with effort. "Yes. And you've had formal training where?" The question hung in the air. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks as she answered truthfully, "Nowhere. I'm self-taught." A murmur rippled through the audience. The maestro's eyebrows rose slightly. "Self-taught," he repeated as if testing the words. "Interesting." Elena waited for the criticism that would surely follow. Notes about her unorthodox fingering, her lack of technical precision, all the flaws a trained ear would easily detect. Instead, the maestro said, "What you lack in classical technique you make up for with something far rarer. Authentic voice. Your composition speaks directly to the heart, without pretense." He turned to the audience. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is why we host these showcases, to discover unexpected talent in unexpected places." Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. The maestro, whose approval was sought by serious musicians throughout the city, was praising her playing. Her vision blurred slightly as tears threatened to form. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The maestro nodded, then addressed the audience once more. "This concludes our showcase for the evening. Thank you all for coming." As people began to gather their belongings, Elena made her way back to her seat in a daze. Ruth was waiting for her, beaming with pride. "I told you," Ruth said, pulling Elena into a quick hug. "I told you your music was special." "I can't believe that just happened," Elena replied, her voice still shaky. "I thought I'd be a disaster." "Far from it," came a voice behind them. Elena turned to find the maestro standing there, his tall figure commanding attention even off the stage. Up close, his eyes were kinder than they had appeared from a distance. "Ms. Winters, I'd like to speak with you a moment, if you have time." Ruth squeezed Elena's arm encouragingly and stepped away, leaving Elena alone with the maestro. Around them, people were filing out of the hall, some glancing curiously in their direction. "Your piece was quite moving," the maestro said. "How long have you been composing?" "I'm not sure I'd call it composing," Elena admitted. "I just play what I feel. I've been doing it for about 15 years since I got my piano." "And you've never had lessons? Never studied music theory?" Elena shook her head. "I couldn't afford lessons. I taught myself by ear, listening to recordings and trying to figure out how the sounds worked together." The maestro nodded thoughtfully. "That explains the unusual chord progressions. In several places, you broke conventional rules, but it worked. It worked beautifully." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Elena. "I teach a small composition seminar on Thursday evenings. Not traditional lessons, but a place for musicians to share their work and receive feedback. I think you would benefit from it, and frankly, the group would benefit from hearing your perspective." Elena stared at the card in her hand, unable to process what was happening. "I don't read music," she reminded him. "I wouldn't be able to follow along." "That's not a requirement for the seminar," he assured her. "Many contemporary composers work primarily by ear." The ability to notate music is useful but not essential to creating it. Before Elena could respond, they were interrupted by a young woman who approached with an air of impatience. "Uncle Richard, are we still having dinner?" "Mom's waiting in the car." "The Maestro," Richard Grayson, Elena realized with a start, hearing his first name for the first time, checked his watch. "Yes, of course, tell her I'll be right out." The young woman nodded and left, casting a curious glance at Elena. "Think about the seminar," the Maestro said, returning his attention to Elena. "Next meeting is this Thursday at 7 at my studio. The address is on the card." With that, he nodded goodbye and followed his niece out of the hall, leaving Elena standing alone with the small white card that somehow felt heavier than its paper weight should allow. Ruth reappeared at her side. "What was that about?" Elena showed her the card. "He invited me to join his composition seminar." Ruth's eyes widened. "Elena, that's incredible. Do you know how exclusive that group is? My neighbor's son, he's been playing since he was 4, has been trying to get in for years." "There must be some mistake," Elena said, still unable to believe it. "Why would he want me there?" "Because you moved him," Ruth said simply. "I watched his face during your performance. That wasn't a teacher evaluating a student. That was a musician being touched by music." The community center was nearly empty. Now, a janitor had begun stacking chairs at the back of the room, and the young man who had checked Elena in was gathering programs left on seats. "We should go," Elena said, suddenly aware of how long they'd been standing there. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing after the warmth of the crowded hall. Stars peeked through the gaps between buildings, and somewhere nearby a street musician played saxophone, the mellow notes floating through the darkness. "Would you like to get coffee?" Ruth asked. "I think this calls for a celebration." Elena hesitated. Part of her wanted to rush home to her piano to capture the feeling of this night before it faded. But another part, a newer part, wanted to stay in this moment a little longer to share it with someone who understood. "I'd like that," she decided. They found a small cafe still open a few blocks away. Over steaming cups of coffee, Elena finally began to process what had happened. The maestro's praise, the audience's response, the invitation to the seminar. It all seemed like a dream, yet the card in her pocket proved it was real. "What will you do?" Ruth asked after Elena had recounted every detail of her conversation with the maestro. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Part of me wants to go. It's an amazing opportunity, but another part is terrified. What if tonight was a fluke? What if I don't belong there after all?" Ruth considered this as she sipped her coffee. "Do you remember how you felt when you were playing tonight? Not before or after, but during." Elena nodded slowly. "I felt right, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do." "That wasn't a fluke," Ruth said firmly. "That was you finally being seen." They talked until the cafe closed, the barista gently reminding them of the time by starting to stack chairs. Outside, they said their goodbyes, Ruth heading toward the bus stop while Elena began the walk home. The streets were quiet now, most windows dark. Elena walked slowly, savoring the night air and the lingering feeling of accomplishment. For so many years, music had been her private joy, a secret garden she tended alone. Now suddenly the gate had been thrown open. It was frightening. It was exhilarating. When she reached her apartment building, Elena paused on the sidewalk, looking up at her window on the second floor. How many nights had she played there, the music contained within those 4 walls? How many melodies had lived and died in that small space, heard by no one but herself? The thought made her both sad and grateful. Sad for all the sharing she had missed, grateful that it wasn't too late to begin. Inside her apartment, Elena didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood in the darkness, letting her eyes adjust, feeling the presence of her piano even before she could see it clearly. Finally, she switched on a small lamp, casting a gentle glow across the room. The piano waited for her, just as it always had. Elena ran her fingers lightly over the lid, a gesture of affection for the faithful friend that had carried her secret voice all these years. She placed the maestro's card carefully on top of the piano, where she would see it in the morning. Thursday was only 3 days away. She had 3 days to decide whether to step further into this new world that had opened before her, or to retreat back into the safety of solitude. Elena sat at the bench and began to play, softly so as not to disturb her neighbors at this late hour. But the melody that emerged wasn't the piece she had performed earlier. It was something new, tentative yet hopeful, questioning yet brave. As her fingers found their way through this uncharted musical territory, Elena realized she had already made her decision. Thursday would come, and she would go to the seminar, not because the maestro had invited her, but because she had invited herself, to a larger life, to a wider world, to the vulnerability and joy of being heard. Thursday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn clarity that made the world seem freshly created. Elena had woken before her alarm, her sleep interrupted by dreams of playing pianos that kept changing shape beneath her hands. She moved through her morning routine in a fog of anticipation and doubt, spilling coffee on her blouse and having to change at the last minute. At the library, she couldn't focus. She shelved novels in the nonfiction section, forgot to stamp due dates, and jumped whenever someone spoke to her. By lunchtime, Ruth had noticed. "You're going tonight, aren't you?" Ruth asked as they ate sandwiches in the staff room. Elena nodded, picking at the crust of her bread. "I think so. Yes." "You don't sound sure." "I'm not," Elena admitted. "What, if I don't fit in?" "These will be serious musicians, Ruth. People who've studied for years, who can read sheet music and talk about theory, and none of them moved an entire room the way you did on Sunday," Ruth interrupted gently. "The maestro invited you for a reason." Elena took a deep breath. "You're right, I know you're right. Besides," Ruth added with a smile, "you've already done the hardest part. You played in front of strangers. After that, talking with a small group of musicians should be easy." But as the day wore on, it didn't feel easy. By closing time, Elena's stomach was in knots. She considered calling the number on the maestro's card to make an excuse. She even rehearsed what she would say. An unexpected headache, a family emergency, anything to postpone facing this new challenge. In the end, it was pride that pushed her forward. Not pride in her music, but the simple human pride that comes from keeping promises, even those made only to oneself. The address on the maestro's card led Elena to a converted warehouse in the arts district. The brick building had large windows and a discreet sign reading Grayson Studio beside the entrance. Elena checked the time on her phone, 6:45 p.m. She was early, but not so early that she would be the first to arrive. Taking a deep breath, she pulled open the heavy door and stepped inside. The space was larger than she had expected, with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. The walls were painted a warm ivory that glowed in the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. At the far end of the room stood not one but 3 pianos, a concert grand, an upright similar to Elena's, and a smaller electronic keyboard. "Ms. Winters, welcome." The maestro appeared from a side door, dressed more casually than he had been at the showcase in a simple button-down shirt and slacks. Without his formal concert attire, he seemed more approachable, though no less dignified. "Please call me Richard when we're here," he said, gesturing for her to come further into the room. "We try to keep things informal at these sessions." Elena nodded, still taking in her surroundings. Along one wall, chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle. A coffee maker burbled on a small table nearby alongside a plate of cookies. "Help yourself to refreshments," Richard said. "The others will be arriving soon." As if on cue, the door opened and a woman entered carrying a violin case. She was perhaps 50, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "Ah, Diane," Richard greeted her. "I'd like you to meet our newest member, Elena Winters. Elena, this is Diane Chen, a violinist with the city orchestra and a brilliant composer in her own right." Diane smiled warmly, extending her free hand. "Richard told us about your performance. I'm sorry I missed it. I had a concert that night." Before Elena could respond, the door opened again. 2 men entered together, deep in conversation. One carried sheet music, the other nothing at all. Behind them came a younger woman with a flute case and a teenage boy who moved with the gangly uncertainty of recent growth. Within 10 minutes, the room had filled with 8 musicians of varying ages and backgrounds. Richard introduced Elena to each of them, and though she immediately forgot most of their names, she was struck by their welcoming smiles and genuine interest. "Before we begin," Richard announced once everyone was seated, "I'd like to ask Elena to share her piece from Sunday's showcase for those who weren't able to attend." Elena froze. She hadn't expected to play tonight, let alone as the first order of business. I didn't prepare. Just play what you played Sunday," Richard encouraged. "Unless you'd prefer to share something else?" All eyes were on her now, curious but kind. Elena swallowed hard and moved to the upright piano, choosing it over the intimidating grand. As she sat on the bench, adjusting her posture, she reminded herself that she had already faced her biggest fear. This was a smaller audience, one predisposed to be supportive. She began to play. The familiar notes calmed her racing heart, and soon she was lost in the music, just as she had been at the showcase. When she finished, the small group applauded, warmly. "Beautiful," said Diane, the violinist. "So emotionally direct." "I'm curious about that middle section," added one of the men. Peter, Elena thought his name was. "The way you modulated from minor to major without traditional transition. Was that intentional?" Elena hesitated, not entirely sure what he meant by modulated. "I just followed what felt right," she admitted. "I don't know the technical terms." "That's what makes it so refreshing," Richard said, joining the conversation. "Elena hasn't been constrained by conventional rules because she's developed her own musical language." What followed was unlike anything Elena had experienced before. For the next hour, they discussed her piece not in a critical way, but with genuine curiosity. They asked about her inspirations, her process, her emotional intentions. Though she stumbled over some of their questions, no one seemed to mind her lack of formal vocabulary. Then it was someone else's turn. The teenage boy, Tim, played a short piece he had composed for his school jazz band. The group listened attentively, then offered feedback that was both honest and encouraging. Elena was surprised to find that even without technical knowledge, she had thoughts to contribute about the emotional impact of certain passages. As the evening progressed, each member shared their work or their musical challenges. The flutist was struggling with a difficult passage in a concerto. The older man was composing a suite inspired by his childhood in rural Italy. Each person's sharing was met with thoughtful response, never harsh criticism. By the time the session ended at 9 o'clock, Elena felt as if she had discovered a new world, one where music was not a performance to be judged, but a conversation to be shared. "Same time next week?" Richard asked as people gathered their belongings. Elena nodded without hesitation. "I'll be here." Outside, the night air had grown cool. Elena buttoned her coat as she began the walk home, her mind replaying moments from the evening. She had spent years playing alone, believing that music was a solitary pursuit for her. Now, she understood it could be both, deeply personal and genuinely connected. As she walked, a melody began to form in her mind, something new, influenced by the discussions of the evening. By the time she reached her apartment, her fingers were itching to find the notes on her piano. She didn't even take off her coat before sitting at the bench. For the next hour, she played, capturing the new composition in her notebook with her personal system of notation. This piece felt different from anything she had written before, more structured in some ways, more adventurous in others. When she finally stopped, her hands tired but satisfied, Elena noticed the time, nearly midnight. She had work tomorrow, but she didn't regret the late night. Something had shifted inside her, a door opening to possibilities she had never imagined. Over the following weeks, Elena's life developed a new rhythm. Thursdays at the studio became the highlight of her week, a time when she could share her musical explorations and learn from others. Some sessions were challenging. Richard pushed her to try new approaches, to stretch beyond her comfort zone, but none were discouraging. At the library, Ruth noticed the change in her friend. "You seem lighter somehow," she observed one afternoon as they worked together. more present. Elena considered this. I think I'm just more myself, she said finally. All these years, I've been hiding part of who I am. Now I don't have to. 3 months after her first showcase performance, Elena participated in another. This time she wasn't the overlooked final performer but featured prominently in the program. She played a new composition, one she had developed with feedback from the Thursday group. The audience's response was even warmer than before. After the showcase, a local music teacher approached her. Would you consider teaching? She asked. Not traditional lessons, but composition for students who struggle with conventional methods. Your approach could really connect with them. The question caught Elena by surprise. I'm not qualified, she began. You have something better than qualifications, the teacher replied. You have genuine understanding of what it means to find your own musical voice. Elena promised to think about it. The idea of helping others, especially those who, like her, didn't fit the traditional mold, appealed to her deeply. That night, alone in her apartment, Elena played the first melody she had ever composed, the simple tune she had discovered during a thunderstorm years ago. It sounded different now, not because the notes had changed, but because she had. The woman who played it was no longer hiding, no longer afraid to be heard. As the final notes faded into silence, Elena thought about how far she had come from that first night at the showcase when she had sat unnoticed in the back row. She thought about the courage it had taken to sign her name to the performers list, and how that single act had changed everything. Most of all, she thought about all the music still waiting inside her, melodies yet to be born, compositions yet to be shared. At 42, Elena Winters was just beginning to discover the full range of her voice, and this time, the world was listening.